Behind the Bookcase by Mark Steensland. Chapter 21. Some very bad news. Edgar clucked his tongue. Now, he said. It's not hopeless at all. Sarah lifted her head slowly. You don't know my brother. That's not what I'm talking about, Edgar said. I'm talking about you getting us out of here. Sarah pointed at herself and raised her eyebrows. Edgar nodded. How do you figure? She asked. Edgar pointed toward the ceiling and Sarah looked up. The only thing she could guess he was pointing at was one of the holes the smoke was going through. They were too small for Edgar or Jeb to fit through, but not for her. She realized immediately what Edgar had in mind. Do you have any idea where they go? Edgar shrugged. What else do you do with smoke but send it outside? Okay, say I can get out. What then? Jeb stepped forward. To the green desert. Get the blemmies. Bring them back here. Get us out. Then we'll all go back to the breach you came through. Sarah shook her head. But I don't know how to get to the green desert. In answer, Edgar whipped open his jacket and revealed rows of pockets inside, each containing a folded piece of paper. He ran his fingers along the edges of several, then plucked one free and shook it open. It was a map drawn in black ink on yellowing paper. It looked terribly old and fragile to Sarah, like a pirate's treasure map. But I thought you ate it, she said. Edgar smiled. I did. The original. I started work on this copy as soon as Balthazar locked me in here. I didn't want to forget everything I had worked so hard to find. Sarah smiled, and the three of them moved closer to the wall, holding the map in the light from one of the blue fire torches. Tell me what you can remember about where you came through, Edgar said. What was the landscape like? Sarah lifted her fingers to her mouth and started chewing on her nails, something she always did when she was thinking her hardest. It's in the forest of shadows, Jeb said, just near the river of moonlight. Moonlight, Sarah said in disbelief. That silver water is moonlight? Jeb nodded. It flows out to the moonlit sea. No wonder it was so cold and tasted so sharp, she said. Edgar and Jeb exchanged glances and then looked back at her grimly. You tasted it? Jeb said. Sarah nodded slowly. What if I did? Jeb swallowed hard. That's how Balthazar makes the sentinels. Sarah suddenly felt cold and wet. She shook her head, trying to deny what they were saying. You mean I'll turn into one of those things that carries the heads around? Jeb nodded. How long before that happens? I've only seen it once. He captured a blemmy and made him drink a whole bucket of moonlight. After that, it didn't take long. A day, maybe. But I only drank a little bit. Then we still have time, Edgar said. But we better get moving. Sarah turned away from the two of them, putting her hand to her forehead. I don't want to turn into one of those things, she said, feeling like she was about to cry. She faced Jeb. Is there any way to stop it? Only Balthazar would know, Jeb said. Oh, Sarah said, turning away from them again. What are we going to do? Pay attention, Edgar said with such force that Sarah was shocked and a little scared. That is what you are going to do. In spite of her fear, she knew he was right. Sometimes you had to take things very seriously, like when they did fire drills at school. You're right, she said. I'm sorry. Edgar put his hand on her shoulder. "No need to apologize. Just make it up to us by getting us out of here." Sarah sniffed back her tears and wiped her nose. Then Edgar pointed at the map. "Here's the Forest of Shadows. The River of Moonlight comes from this mountain. This spot here," Edgar put his finger on an X, "is where you came through. It's the only breach in that area." Sarah nodded. Edgar pointed to another spot on the map. "This is where we are, in the Black Iron Prison. Here is the Moonlit Sea. And here is Crooked Canyon. If you follow that, you can reach the Green Desert and cross it to where the Blemmies are, here." Edgar handed Sarah the map, and she looked at it closely, making sure she had followed everywhere he had pointed. "Can you do it?" Edgar asked. "Of course she can," said Jeb. "I know she can." Sarah looked up at him and smiled. "That settles it, then, huh?" She folded the map and put it in her pocket. "Almost," Jeb said, lifting his shirt. He took out the glass case containing his face and held it out to her. "Can you take this with you? Keep it safe?" Sarah frowned and shook her head. "I don't think that's a good idea." "Of course it is. But what if something happens to me? I trust you. Besides, if I keep it here, it's only a matter of time before they search me, find it, and take it away." Sarah nodded and took the case, suddenly overwhelmed by their faith in her. Yes, it was her fault that all of this had happened. But now she had the chance to undo all the bad things. More than that, to make everything right again. To give Jeb his face back and to free Edgar so that he could return home. At once, Edgar set to work helping Jeb onto his shoulders. They stood against the wall and then helped Sarah climb up their backs. When she reached Jeb's shoulders, he held on to the base of one of the torch mounts and they carefully leaned away from the wall. Sarah reached one hand into the dark hole. She found an edge and quickly pulled herself up. When she was halfway in, Jeb pushed her feet through, then went back to the wall and climbed down from Edgar's shoulders. The two of them stood on the floor and looked up, waiting to hear what she saw. "Well," Edgar said. The truth was, Sarah could see only darkness. She had half expected to see stars, but then she remembered that the sky in Skitopia had no stars. What if the darkness above her wasn't the sky? Sarah wondered. Then she realized that it didn't matter. This was the only way out. "I can see the sky," Sarah called back to them, hoping they couldn't hear the doubt creeping into her voice. "It's pretty far away, but I can see it." "Hurry, then, child," Edgar called to her. "Once they find out you are gone, they will send everyone after you." "Why didn't you tell me that before?" she asked. "Never mind that. Now hurry." Sarah waved at them one last time, then faced the darkness and climbed toward it. Chapter 22. A Leap of Faith. The smoke vent was long and narrow and seemed to be getting narrower the higher she went. She looked back down, but could see only a bare sliver of blue light far below her feet. She inched along, pulling herself with one arm, holding the glass case with Jeb's face tightly in the other. Just when she thought the vent would never end, her fingers found the top edge and she heaved a sigh of relief. Gripping as hard as she could, she pulled herself up. Then she felt a terrible scraping as the glass case with Jeb's face got stuck between the cold stone walls of the smoke vent. No, Sarah whispered, worried that their plan would be undone before it even started. She pushed the case back down again, as hard as she could. It slid free with such force that she nearly dropped it. She tried pulling it up again, but realized that it wouldn't fit through with her body at the same time. Carefully, she lifted her head up and looked over the edge of the smoke vent. She was on a wall overlooking the platform where Mr. Ink had dropped them. Along the wall on the far side, she saw a pair of the squat one-eyed creatures clutching blue torches. Otherwise, the space was empty. She pulled herself up a little higher and looked over her shoulder. The moonlit sea stretched out behind her as far as she could see, just as Edgar had shown her on the map. As she climbed out of the vent, she let the glass case slide down the front of her body to her feet. Sitting on the edge of the vent, she pulled her feet up slowly, little by little, until she could grab the case and pull it free. As she stood, she was relieved to see that she was on the outer wall. Had she come out near the platform, she would have still been trapped inside the black iron prison. Here on the wall, nothing but air stood between her and the sea below. This was the good news, but it was also the bad news. In order to get away, she had to jump. There was simply no other choice. If she didn't jump, they would never be free. She tried to remember all the times she had jumped from high places. She remembered the diving board at her friend Molly's house. Although she had been scared to jump at first, she had soon discovered how much fun it was. By the end of that summer, in fact, she had become an expert at jumping on the board hard enough to bounce fairly high. The next summer, she had moved up to the high dive at the Orange Park pool. She had been scared at first with that too, but once she had done it a few times, Molly's old diving board seemed positively boring. When they had gone camping later, her mom and dad had taken her to a swimming hole with a cliff that was twice as high as the high dive. She hadn't wanted to jump off it at first. Then, finally, on the last day of their stay, she had gotten her nerve up and gone in. The jump before her now was easily more than 3 times as high as that cliff at the campground. Even though she knew she had no choice, she still felt scared. Was the moonlight deep enough? Would it act just like water and really catch her fall? What if she swallowed more of it when she went under? That would make her turn into one of those sentinels even faster. Sarah shook her head and took a step backward, away from the wall. She lifted the glass case and looked at Jeb's face. The eye was closed, as if this small part of him was sleeping. She wished he were with her now. She wished she could hold his hand and they could jump together. Then she decided that this was really the next best thing. So she gripped the case tightly in both hands and ran toward the edge as fast as she could. The fall seemed impossibly long. The walls of the black iron prison whooshed past her, dark and cold. When at last she plunged into the icy moonlight, she squeezed her eyes shut and held her breath, closing her mouth as tightly as possible. Down into the blinding depths she went. The moonlight was not as dense as water, so she went much deeper than she expected. When her feet touched the bottom, she pushed hard and shot toward the surface. When she broke through, she caught a deep breath and paddled hard, pulling herself toward the shore. Some of the moonlight got into her mouth and she winced once again with the sharp taste of it, spitting it out frantically. It was much harder to swim in the moonlight than in water. The more she flapped her arms and legs, the less progress she seemed to make. She got tired very fast. For a short time, she was afraid she wasn't going to make it. Then the waves pushed at her back and her feet found the ground, and she walked the rest of the way to the shore. The moonlight streamed off her body and onto the black sand around her. How strange it was to feel she should be wet and yet still be perfectly dry. She looked behind her at the towering face of the black iron prison and couldn't believe she had jumped from such a height. She thought of Jeb and Edgar still inside the blue suite and knew that she must hurry to get them out of there. She took the map out of her pocket and unfolded it. She retraced the path Edgar had shown her, from the black iron prison to the moonlit sea, and then along the shoreline to Crooked Canyon and the green desert beyond. She folded the map again and neatly tucked it back into her pocket, then made sure she had a good grip on the glass case with Jeb's face. With one last look over her shoulder, she started up the beach. Chapter 23. A Change of Plans. Eventually, the beach gave way to rockier ground and an uphill slope. It would have been easier to leave the beach and head to higher ground, but as far as Sarah could tell from the map, the mouth of Crooked Canyon opened at the sea's edge. So she picked her way over a series of boulders and stuck to the ever-narrowing strip of sand closest to the lapping moonlight. The ground to her left got higher and higher, rising into the sky at such a steep angle, it began to look like it would fall on her. She saw holes in the rock face that looked like caves, and she shivered at the thought of what might live in them. She picked up her pace and finally found what she hoped was the entrance to Crooked Canyon. Just to be sure, she walked across the mouth to the other side, where she discovered it was completely blocked by a pile of fallen boulders. If she wanted to go any farther, she would have to climb the steep wall or swim around it. She decided that even if this wasn't Crooked Canyon, it was the way she was going. She took a deep breath and started along the path. The walls of the canyon were steep and high. The narrow band of starless sky looked like a dark blue river. Inside the canyon, the sound of the moonlit sea crashing onto the shore behind her got even louder. As the path cut to the left and then back to the right again, Sarah began to feel certain that this must be Crooked Canyon. It was certainly crooked enough. With every turn, the moonlit sea slipped farther from view and the canyon grew darker. After getting caught by Mr. Ink, she felt especially scared of the shadows. He could be in any of the pools of darkness. In fact, he could actually be any of the pools of darkness. She shivered at the thought and picked up her pace, trying to concentrate instead on following the path. Psst! Something hissed behind her, and Sarah jumped, shrieking. She whirled around quickly and peered into the darkness, her eyes darting back and forth. She stepped backward and caught her foot on a rock, tripped, and sat down hard. The darkness between two rocks shifted, and a pair of glowing yellow eyes blinked at her. "Who's there?" she asked. The creature, just bigger than her little brother, Billy, waddled into the middle of the path, stood up straight, and stretched its wings open. It was a giant bat, but with a little boy's face. He twitched his ears at her and stepped closer. "I don't know," he said sadly. I was hoping you could tell me." All at once, Sarah felt relieved. He wasn't scary, just scared. Maybe even more scared of her than she was of him. "You mean you don't even know your own name?" she said as she got back to her feet. He looked at her, stretching his wings once more before folding them back at his side, then shook his head. "No," he said. "My name's Sarah," she said, and held out her hand. He shook it with the tiny hook at the top of his wing. "Nice to meet you," he said. "Did you ever know your name?" The Bat Boy shrugged. "I don't remember." "Can you remember anything?" "Just that I've always been in this place." "You mean here in Crooked Canyon? Is that what it's called?" Sarah nodded and suddenly felt very sad for the little Bat Boy. She suspected that he was another of Balthazar's victims. Like Jeb, only instead of stealing a part of his face, Balthazar had turned him into a giant bat with no memory. She wished there was some way she could help him, too. Then she had an idea. "Can you fly?" she asked. The Bat Boy nodded. "Have you ever been to the Green Desert?" He shrugged. "I don't know, but if I told you how to get to the Green Desert, you could fly me there, right?" "I could try. If you would help me do that, then maybe I could help you find out your name." "You could?" Sarah nodded. "I could try. What do you say?" "Hop on," the Bat Boy said. "Before I do that, we need to decide what I should call you. Until we find out your real name, I mean. I wouldn't feel right saying, 'Hey, you,' all the time. What would you like to call me?" Sarah held her chin in one hand and stared at him for a long time. "Well," she said, "you're like a bat and a boy. But Bat Boy doesn't sound very nice. Suppose I just call you BB for short. BB? What do you think?" He considered it for a moment, then nodded. "BB it is." Sarah smiled and climbed onto BB's back. The spots not covered with heavy black fur were leathery but warm. "Okay," she said, locking her arms around his thick neck. "Okay," he said, and spread his wings wide, flapping until they rose into the air. They veered to the left for so long that Sarah thought they were going to crash into the wall. Then BB changed course and they veered to the right, coming so close to the top of Crooked Canyon that Sarah's feet knocked some rocks loose. Once they were in the open, BB really flapped his wings and they rose even higher into the dark blue sky. Sarah gasped at the view. The moonlit sea lay behind them, stretching out for what seemed like forever. Far back on her left, she could just make out the dark square of the black iron prison. "Which way?" BB yelled above the keening wind. Sarah faced forward and pointed along the length of Crooked Canyon. "Follow the canyon," she shouted. "No need to shout," BB yelled back at her. "My ears are very sensitive." She had forgotten learning in school how sensitive bats' ears were. "Sorry," she said, more quietly this time. BB nodded and flapped them still higher. Now Sarah could even see the forest of shadows, far beyond the black iron prison. All at once, she realized that BB could just take her straight there, back to the place where she had come through. She needn't worry about how far above the ground the hole was. BB could fly her right in. And if the sentinels or Lefty tried to get her, BB could fly her out of their reach. The only one she had to worry about was Mr. Ink, since he could fly, too. But he wouldn't be looking for her there. As far as she knew, he was still at the Black Iron prison, waiting to see what the guards were going to do with her and Jeb. She began to wonder if they had discovered she was missing yet. Edgar had said they would send everyone to search for her. She suddenly became sure they would look for her in the Green Desert, since they knew that was where she and Jeb had been headed before Mr. Ink caught them. So maybe she should go back to the Forest of Shadows. She worried about Jeb and Edgar, but she knew the most important thing was stopping Balthazar, especially since he was the only one who could tell her how to stop from changing into a sentinel. Besides, she wasn't even sure she would be able to convince the Blemmies to start a new rebellion. "Oh, dear," she whispered. "What is it?" Phoebe said. "I think we better change direction." "Which way?" "That way," Sarah said, and pointed left. "To the Forest of Shadows." Phoebe nodded and lifted his right wing. They careened into a sharp turn, and Sarah tightened her grip. As they flew past the Black Iron prison, Sarah saw a door open and a thin line of squat guards march out. They were so far below that the blue torches they clutched looked like tiny matches. She knew they were searching for her, and from the looks of it, they were headed toward Crooked Canyon and the Green Desert. She heaved a sigh of relief, sure now that she had made the right decision. On they flew, across the river of moonlight and deep into the Forest of Shadows. Sarah asked Phoebe to take them lower. When she spotted the clearing and Balthazar's cabin, she pointed Phoebe toward the face of the Black Mountains. As they got closer, Sarah frantically searched the ground for Lefty or the Sentinel, but didn't spot any sign of either of them. She knew she should have been relieved, but she actually grew more worried. Not knowing where they were seemed much worse than finding them waiting for her. "Take us down, please," she said, and Phoebe folded his wings back. They plunged toward the ground, and at the last possible moment, Phoebe unfolded his wings and brought them to what seemed a complete stop in midair, before setting them down softly. The rapid descent had so frightened Sarah that she hadn't had time to direct Phoebe to a close landing position, so when she looked up, she saw that they were still some distance from the mountainside. "This way," she said urgently. She took off, her feet kicking up black sand as Phoebe waddled behind for a moment, then flapped his wings and flew after her. They reached the mountainside at about the same time. Phoebe landed next to her and glanced around. "What are we doing here?" he asked. Sarah pointed at the hole in the rock. "Do you see that hole?" she asked. Phoebe followed her finger with his eyes and nodded. "I need you to get me up there." "Sure thing," he said, and motioned for her to climb onto his back. Instead of flying, he used his sharp claws and the hooks at the tops of his wings to crawl up the rocks to the ledge just under the hole. Sarah climbed off and peered into the darkness. Now that she was here, she wasn't sure what to do next. After all, she had completely ditched the original plan. "What's in there?" Phoebe asked. "My house," Sarah said. "You live in a cave, too?" Phoebe said with a smile. "Can I come with you?" Sarah explained to him as quickly as she could that this wasn't a normal cave, that it was more like a hallway to a world very different from Skitopia, and that she had to go there and do some very important work. "And I have to go alone," she said. "But when will you help me find my name?" Phoebe asked. "You said you would." Sarah nodded. And I will, I promise. Until then, I need you to keep helping me. How? I need you to wait here, right here, until I come back. Can you do that? Sure, Phoebe said. Sarah smiled. Good. I'll be back as fast as I can, she said, then gave Phoebe a hug and climbed into the dark tunnel. Chapter 24. Disaster at Home. As Sarah crept back into the secret room behind the bookcase, her mind raced with 100 trains of thought. She wondered if Edgar's theory was true. Had time stood still while she had been gone? Or had it continued normally because she had brought Balthazar through? Had Balthazar figured out where the journal was? Had he tricked Billy into helping him? She pushed through the darkness until she felt the back of the bookcase. Then she pressed against it gently until it slid out from the wall. When there was enough space, she peeked through to make sure the coast was clear. She was about to go into her room when she realized she was still holding the glass case with Jed's face in it. She knew she couldn't take it with her. How could she explain that to anyone? Carefully, she set the case down against the wall, then slipped into her bedroom and pushed the bookcase back into position. She let out a deep breath and looked around. At first, she thought everything was exactly as she had left it, but then she saw the clock and she knew Edgar was right. It was 2:37 p.m. Time had continued normally, and she had been gone for more than 4.5 hours. Feeling sick with the thought of what might have happened, she rushed across the room, flung the door open, and ran downstairs. She found her mother in the kitchen, standing at the sink washing potatoes, a red dish towel slung over one shoulder. "What do you think you're doing, young lady? Your father told you to stay in your room until dinner." Her mother looked at the clock over the stove. "And that's not for more than 2 hours." Sarah stopped short and stared at her mom, absolutely speechless. She didn't know what to say. A part of her wanted to tell her everything, top to bottom, start to finish. But even as her mouth opened and the first words started to form on her lips, she knew she couldn't. If Sarah told her about secret doors and talking cats, Mom certainly wouldn't believe her. In fact, she would probably send her back to her room for the rest of the day before she called a doctor to come over and find out what was wrong with her. Then Sarah considered that maybe she should instead tell her mom there was a secret room behind the bookcase and get her to go inside that way, but she doubted that would work either. Mom didn't like small spaces, and she was very afraid of spiders. Sarah was sure Mom would refuse to go behind the bookcase for those 2 reasons, and then Sarah would be stuck again. She might be able to convince her dad to go in there, but he would probably tell her he couldn't do it right away and would promise instead to do it tomorrow, which would certainly be too late. Sarah now realized that she had been staring at her mom for a long time without saying anything, so she finally decided to stick with the simplest explanation, even though it was a lie. "I thought I heard you call me," she said. Mom lifted her eyebrows. "You did you?" Sarah nodded. "Well, I didn't," Mom said. "But since you've stayed in your room this long without complaining and without asking for a break, your punishment can be over." Sarah was surprised and relieved. "Thanks, Mom," she said, then added as quickly as she could, "Have you seen Balthazar?" "I think he was outside with Billy." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "When was that?" she said. After lunch, maybe? Sarah started toward the back door. Is Billy still out there? I don't know, Mom said. He's been coming and going all afternoon, taking stuff from the room upstairs down to the basement. Sarah nodded, then stepped onto the back porch and looked around for any sign of Billy or Balthazar. She knew that she had to be careful. As far as Balthazar knew, Sarah still thought he was just the king of the cats, and she had no intention of letting him find out otherwise. She was fairly certain that if he knew that she knew the truth, he would hurt her somehow, the way he had taken off half of Jeb's face. He might even do something to her whole family. Balthazar, she called. Here, kitty, kitty. She kissed the air as loudly as she could, but heard no reply, not even a meow. She descended the steps to the yard and headed for the bushes along the fence, calling his name and kissing the air. But still she got no reply. Maybe he was in the basement. After all, Mom had said that Billy had been taking stuff down there. Sarah returned to the house. She went through the back door and down the steps into the basement. It was dark and silent. Balthazar, she called. Still no answer. A new fear took hold of her now. Had Balthazar already accomplished his plan? Had he gotten the door to Penumbra open, stolen the sleeping souls, and taken them back to Scatopia? She didn't see how that was possible, but she couldn't figure out how else to explain Balthazar's absence. When she turned around, Billy was standing at the top of the stairs, a box in his hands. Punishments all over, huh? He asked. Sarah nodded. Have you seen Balthazar? Yeah, Billy said, coming down the stairs. He set his box down on a stack of other boxes. He scratched me and then ran into the bushes by the fence. I don't know where he went after that, and I don't care. Billy went back up the steps and Sarah followed him quickly. Can you show me exactly where that happened? No, Billy said. I hope you never find that cat again. I don't want him to ever come back here. Billy, Mom said from the kitchen. Don't talk like that. Billy hung his head. All right, he said. Come on. Billy took Sarah outside and around the side of the house, near the basement window. He pointed at the thick bushes along the low fence. He ran right through there. Why did he scratch you? I don't know. We were playing with a piece of string Mom tied to my key. Do you still have it? The key or the string? The key. Billy nodded again and pulled it out of his pocket and showed it to her. Sarah started to reach for it, but Billy closed his hand fast. It's mine. Mom gave it to me. Do you want to get in trouble again? Sarah pulled her hand away. Billy started toward the back door, but Sarah said, wait. I want to ask you something else. What? Did Balthazar talk to you? Billy stared at Sarah for a long moment. What do you mean? Sarah shook her head. Never mind, she said, and forced herself to laugh. I was just kidding. You're weird, Billy said, and went into the house. Sarah looked into the bushes and whispered Balthazar's name, but the only reply was the crunching of the branches as she pushed them aside with her hands. A moment later, she spotted what must have been the string from Billy's key on the ground, and she picked it up. So Balthazar had tried to get the key. When he couldn't, he'd gotten mad, scratched Billy, and taken off. But where was he now? Why wouldn't he come when he heard Sarah calling? Sarah, Mom shouted from inside the house. Come inside now and get back to packing. Be right there, Sarah answered. She climbed the steps and opened the door. Before she went inside, she took one last look at the yard, but it was still empty. Sarah hardly said a word for the rest of the day, including dinner. Instead, she concentrated on trying to figure out where Balthazar could have gone or what he was up to. One possibility was that he had run too far away and someone else had picked him up, thinking he was just a stray cat. If that was the case, hopefully they would do what she and her father had done. When they came to her door with the cat in a box, she could say he was hers and then take him back to Skitopia and figure out how to close off the secret passage forever. It also occurred to her that maybe he had just given up on Billy and had instead gone in search of someone else who could help him. Someone he could convince to break into their house while they were all asleep and steal the key from Billy. This made her so afraid that she started shaking. She shook so hard, a bite of food fell off her fork. Are you okay? Mom asked. I'm fine, Sarah said. I'm just worried about Balthazar. Dad shook his head. Maybe it's best if he doesn't come back, honey. Sarah nodded. Her dad was right, in a way. She wished Balthazar would get run over by a car or something. That would solve all her problems, wouldn't it? She lifted another bite to her mouth, but then decided she wasn't hungry anymore. Can I be done? She said. You didn't eat very much, Mom said. I'm not hungry. Mom looked at Dad. Dad shrugged. Fine with me, he said, and Sarah took her plate to the kitchen sink. Then she went outside and sat on the back porch, staring at the yard, kissing the air and calling to Balthazar every few minutes. She simply didn't know what else to do. She couldn't go back to Skitopia now because she still had to take a shower and get ready for bed. She would have to wait until her parents had kissed her goodnight before she could go behind the bookcase again. When it got dark, Mom called her inside. After her shower, she put her pajamas on and climbed into bed with a book. Then Mom and Dad came in. After kisses, they went out of her room and closed the door all the way. She listened to them tuck Billy in and then go downstairs. A few minutes later, as soon as she heard the TV go on, she threw the covers back and got dressed. Chapter 25. The Truth at Last. She had just started to pull the bookcase out of the wall when she heard a click in the hallway. She froze. Then she shoved the bookcase back into the wall, dove into bed, and pulled the covers up as fast as she could. She was sure Mom or Dad had come back upstairs to check on her for some reason. She held her breath as she waited for her door to open. When she heard a second click, she realized that it wasn't her door. It was Billy's. She threw the covers back again and crept across the room as quickly and carefully as she could. She knelt in front of her door, peering through the keyhole. The hallway was dark except for the glow of the nightlight from the bathroom. Still, that was enough light to see that Billy's bedroom door was opening very slowly. And now Billy was peering out. He opened the door wider. He, too, had gotten dressed. He had the key in one hand and the big red book in the other. All at once Sarah knew that her brother had lied to her. Not only did Balthazar know about the journal, but he had talked to Billy, too. Now her brother was sneaking down to meet the cat in the basement and open the door to Penumbra for him. That was why Balthazar hadn't answered. He didn't need her anymore. He was probably hiding down there and had been all afternoon waiting for this moment. Sarah was very tempted to throw the door open and yell for Mom and Dad. She and Billy would both get in big trouble for being dressed and out of bed, but at least she would stop Balthazar from going through with his plan. She was just about to open her mouth when she realized that she could only catch Balthazar if she let Billy meet him. So she held her breath and watched Billy sneak to the corner of the hallway and disappear from view. She waited a long moment, then opened her door wide and poked her head out. She could just see his shadow descending the stairs. She couldn't believe he was risking this. Mom and Dad were almost sure to catch him. She waited until she couldn't see his shadow on the wall anymore, then crept out of her room and closed the door. She tiptoed up the hallway and looked over the railing. She saw Billy at the bottom of the stairs, peeking around the corner into the living room, no doubt making sure Mom and Dad couldn't see him. After a moment, he darted into the kitchen, out of Sarah's sight. Sarah went to the landing and was halfway downstairs when she heard Dad get up and tell Mom he would be right back. She backed up quickly, crouching in the shadows at the top of the stairs. She watched Dad walk into the kitchen. Every muscle tightened as she waited to hear Dad shout at Billy, but all she heard was the ice maker crunching ice into a glass and the pop of a soda can being opened. A moment later, Dad walked back into the living room. Sarah let out her breath and went down the stairs on her tiptoes. At the bottom, she peered into the living room and saw Mom and Dad facing the TV, watching an old black and white movie. She went into the kitchen carefully, half afraid that she would find Billy coming out from a hiding place somewhere. But the kitchen was empty. Assuming that he had already gone into the basement, Sarah went to the door and opened it carefully. She saw light from a flashlight sweep across the far wall. She stepped onto the landing and closed the door. Even more carefully than before, Sarah went down the stairs. She lowered her head, trying to see where Billy was. The light flashed again, this time sweeping across the stacks of furniture and crates near the boiler. She moved down the stairs more quickly. Once she reached the bottom, she crouched and crept forward to a row of boxes. Peeking over the top, she saw Billy, alone, standing at the door behind the boiler. One hand held the flashlight trained on the heavy padlock while the other hand lifted the key and put it in the lock. When she still saw no sign of Balthazar, she decided that Billy must have already let him into Penumbra, but had been forced to close and lock the door when Mom had come downstairs or something. Sarah crept forward another inch as Billy turned the key in the lock and popped it open. He pulled the padlock off and set it on the ground along with the journal. Then he pulled the heavy door open to reveal an alcove filled with dim light. Another door stood on the opposite side, a good 20 feet away. This door looked older than the first, and it was not locked. Then Billy said, "Hello, Billy," and Sarah nearly fell over. Her breath caught in her throat, and she slowly lifted herself high enough to see the alcove floor. There, bound hand and foot with yellow nylon rope, was her little brother. He was staring at the other Billy with wide eyes. But the worst part of all was that the Billy who was tied up on the floor had no mouth. Sarah very nearly screamed then. To stop herself, she had to bite her tongue and squeeze her eyes shut. Now she knew the truth. The Billy who had met her on the stairs that afternoon had not been her brother at all. Balthazar had simply changed disguises. He had lured Billy into the basement and gotten the door open. Then he had changed into Billy, tied the real Billy up, and waited until he could come back to finish the job. Sarah was frantic. If Balthazar could change into Billy like that, who knew what else he could do? If she screamed for help, might he not simply turn into a giant dragon and destroy them all with a single breath of fire? One thing she knew for certain. She couldn't leave Billy behind, no matter how annoying he was. She crept forward slowly, taking cover behind the boxes and furniture. She got as close to the first door as she dared, then waited as Balthazar went to the inner door and opened it. Beyond it was a giant space, as dimly illuminated by dark gray light as the alcove, filled with rows and rows of what looked like thousands of beds. People covered with white sheets lay on the beds, which seemed to stretch on as far as she could see, up a gentle slope of gray grass. Balthazar, still in his disguise as Billy, stood in the open doorway, his arms outstretched. "At last," he said. "Penumbra." Sarah took advantage of his distraction to dart forward and grab the real Billy. When he saw her, his eyes went wide. She tried to help him to his feet, but halfway up, he stumbled and fell, pushing them both back. Balthazar heard the noise and whirled around. His face was no longer Billy's. Instead, his hair had turned to smoke and his eyes to fire. Sarah closed the door, snatched the lock from the ground, and put it through the latch. Balthazar pushed on the door from the inside, but Sarah snapped the lock shut. She held her breath, afraid Balthazar would start pounding on the door from the inside and bring Mom and Dad down. But instead he only whispered, "I'll find another way out. Little girl, don't you know that? My plan will succeed, and I have you to thank for it." At the sound of his voice, goosebumps crowded the back of Sarah's neck. But she had no time to be scared. She turned to Billy and quickly untied the ropes. She did her best to explain to him that she knew what had happened and that she would tell him more soon. But for now, she whispered, "We have to get back upstairs without Mom and Dad knowing. Can you do that?" He nodded. "Good," she said. Then she took the key from the lock, picked up the journal, and grabbed Billy by the hand. "Come on." Chapter 26. Grandma Winnie explains it all. Sarah stopped short when she saw someone coming down the stairs. She couldn't tell whether it was Mom or Dad. Not that it mattered. Either one spelled bad news, although Mom would probably not be as likely to yell. They must have heard her and Billy down here. Now everything would come out. What would they say when they saw Billy's face? Sarah sighed. Maybe this was for the best. She was tired of trying to make everything right all on her own. Briefly, she considered hiding, then decided that would only make things worse. Standing up as straight as she could, she stepped out and came face to face not with her mom or dad, but with Grandma Winnie. Sarah screamed. "Oh, no, child," Grandma said to her. "I wish you hadn't done that." Sarah's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She looked at Billy, but Billy just stared at her as if he couldn't figure out what was happening. Sarah heard voices overhead, followed by footsteps pounding from the living room to the kitchen. Mom and Dad were coming for sure. "Quick," Grandma Winnie said. "You and your brother stand behind me and get under my shawl." Sarah grabbed Billy and pulled him close. Then Grandma turned around. She whipped her shawl off her shoulders and draped it over them like a magician. All at once, Sarah realized she could see through Grandma Winnie and she wanted to scream again. But then the light went on and Mom and Dad came down the stairs. "I swear I heard someone scream," Mom said. "Me too," Dad said. It sounded like Sarah. Her parents were staring straight at her and Billy and Grandma Winnie, but it was obvious they couldn't see them. Then, as they stepped to the floor, Grandma Winnie moved forward, floating, carrying Sarah and Billy with her. They glided right past Mom and Dad, and as they went upstairs, Sarah heard Dad say, "Maybe we should check on the children." "That's a good idea," Mom said. Sarah looked over her shoulder and saw them headed back to the stairs, but then Grandma floated around the corner and up to their rooms. "Quickly now," Grandma said. "Both of you get in your beds and pretend you're asleep." Sarah and Billy did as she told them. And not a moment too soon, for Sarah had barely pulled the covers to her chin when her door opened and Mom and Dad leaned through. "She in there?" Dad asked. "Sound asleep," Mom said, and closed the door. Sarah jumped out of bed and peered through the keyhole, watching her parents repeat the routine at Billy's door. A few moments later, they headed downstairs. Sarah leaned back and caught her breath, her mind racing with what had just happened. When her door opened and Billy came in, she was actually glad to see him, and evidently he felt the same way. They hugged each other tightly. "Is Grandma Winnie with you?" Sarah asked. Billy looked at her and shook his head. "Did you see Grandma Winnie?" Again, Billy shook his head. "Oh," Sarah said, confused. Then it dawned on her. She had been holding the journal and the key. Jeb had told her that they only worked together, and only when they were together could the record keeper show the sleeping dead the way to Penumbra. Sarah jumped to her feet and ran to her bed. She threw the covers back and grabbed the journal and the key. When she turned around, she saw Grandma Winnie standing in the corner. Sarah heaved a sigh of relief. "There you are," she whispered. "You had me worried," Grandma said. "I thought I was going to have to start throwing letters around and banging books on the floor again." "That was you?" Sarah asked. Grandma nodded. "I was trying to get your attention. I started as soon as you got here." Sarah smiled. "I knew it," she said. "Was that you last night at the door, too?" Grandma shook her head slowly. "Those are all the sleeping dead. They're here because it's their time to enter Penumbra, but I can't let them in because, well, look at me." "You mean there are dead people outside?" Grandma nodded and went to the window. Sarah followed her and looked down. In the yard below, their forms outlined by the silver moonlight, were about 24 people shuffling aimlessly around the yard. "They'll knock again at 3 o'clock, just like they've been doing every night." Billy appeared next to Sarah and looked out the window. Seeing nothing but the empty yard, he shrugged. "Oh," Sarah said. You can't see them, can you? Billy shook his head. Sarah said, "Here," and shoved the journal and key toward him. He touched the key with one hand and the journal with the other. When he looked out the window again, his eyes widened. Sarah was quite sure that if he'd had a mouth, he would have been smiling and saying "cool" in that annoying and reverential tone. She shook her head and turned to Grandma again. "So what do we do?" "We've got to get them into Penumbra." Sarah nodded, then realized that that simply wasn't possible, not with Balthazar in there. She looked at the floor. "What is it, child?" Grandma asked. "I'm afraid I've made some big mistakes," Sarah said. She took a deep breath and explained how she had found Scritopia and how she had thought Balthazar was her friend. Then she told them about Jeb and how he had made her see the truth. Balthazar only wanted to get into Penumbra so he could steal the sleeping souls who really belonged in Ormuz. She told Billy not to worry about his missing mouth because Balthazar had taken half of Jeb's face, but she was sure they would figure out a way to put both of them back the way they were. Just then, the bookcase slowly came out of the wall, scraping across the floor. Sarah and Billy and Grandma all looked at each other, then looked back at the bookcase. It edged forward again. For a moment, Sarah thought she should throw herself against it and stop whoever, or whatever, it was from getting through. But it was too late. The bookcase slid out farther, and she saw the hooked tip of BB's wing poke through just before she heard him whisper, "Sarah? Are you in there?" Sarah let a breath out. "It's okay," she whispered. "It's BB. I'm trying to help him, too." She let Billy hold the key and the journal and pulled the bookcase out far enough to let BB in. He waddled into her room and glanced around. "Boy, am I glad to see you," he said. "I know you told me to wait down there for you, but I couldn't. Not when I saw those other things show up." "What other things?" Sarah asked. "A giant hand and a guy carrying a head. Lefty and one of the sentinels." "Did they see you?" Phoebe shook his head. "I heard them coming and I backed into the tunnel. Once I actually saw them, I knew they were bad." "What did they do?" Phoebe shook his head again. "I didn't stay around long enough to see. I was so worried, all I could think about was finding you. So I climbed up and here I am." Sarah nodded. "You did the right thing. But if they're down there guarding the entrance, how are we going to get back to Scritopia?" Phoebe looked at her sadly. "Does this mean you won't be able to help me find out my real name?" "No," Sarah said. "I will. It just might take longer than I thought." She sat down on the edge of the bed and hit her head with her palms. "Think, think," she said. "I know that Jeb got through from a different house. And Edgar found a lot of ways in." She pulled the map from her pocket and unfolded it. "But his map just shows where the doors are inside Scritopia." Sarah sighed. "If only there were some way we could get back to Scritopia, I could get help from the Blemmies or Edgar." Billy came over and tapped Sarah on the shoulder frantically. "Leave me alone, Billy. I'm trying to think." But he only tapped harder. When she finally looked at him, she saw he was shoving the journal and the key at her. She grabbed them both and Grandma Winnie popped into view. "You must go to Ormuz," she said. "Ormuz," Sarah said with a nod, remembering how Jeb had told her it was the place where light comes from. If anyone would know how to fight shadows, it would be someone there. "That's a good idea, Grandma," Sarah said. But how do I get there? Use the other door. What other door? Sarah asked. In the blue room where your brother is staying. The passage behind his bookcase leads to Orma's. Of course it does, she said, and together they all moved as quickly and quietly as they could into Billy's room. Billy had already taken all the books off the shelves. So Sarah simply grabbed the middle shelf and pulled as hard as she could. Nothing happened. Her shoulders sagged. Then she tried again. She grabbed the middle shelf and pulled hard. Maybe I'm not strong enough, she said. Can you help, BB? BB waddled forward and put the hooks at the tips of his wings on the outer edge of the bookcase. He pressed them between the wood and the wall, then tugged outward. There was a cracking sound, and at last the bookcase came free. Relieved, Sarah wiped her forehead. Thanks, BB, she said, pulling the bookcase out the rest of the way. She peered into the space, expecting to see the same kind of darkness as behind her bookcase. But instead, she saw light shining down at the back. She smiled and looked at the others. Then she took the journal and key from Billy and asked Grandma if she could come with her. No, child, Grandma Winnie said. I can't. I hope I'll be able to someday. But until then, I'm supposed to be in Penumbra. Sarah nodded, then faced Billy and BB. You two better go back to the other side and keep watch. If anyone tries to come through from Skitopia, come over here and find me. I'll be back as soon as I can. Are you sure that's a good idea? BB asked. It's all we've got, she said, then slipped behind Billy's bookcase and walked toward the light. Chapter 27. To the Court of the Cloud Queen. Orma's was nothing like she had expected. When Sarah slid out of the tunnel, she found herself floating in the air right in front of a giant cloud. She looked down and saw no ground at her feet, just clouds drifting past. When they parted, she saw the biggest, brightest ocean ever, even brighter than the moonlit sea in Skitopia. Not knowing what else to do, she flapped her arms gently and twisted her body around. Clouds moved past her on every side, even high above her. The sky she floated in was a delicate pale blue. Sarah smiled. How she had ever thought dark old Skitopia was any fun at all, she didn't know. Suddenly, Sarah noticed that the cloud she had come through was slowly moving away from her. She flapped her arms and pushed herself toward it. She grabbed it and found that it felt like cotton. For a moment, she had a grip, but as it moved away from her and she pulled harder, the cloud tore. She let the small piece go and it floated away. She flapped her arms again and pushed herself up, back toward the hole she had come through. Only, now she saw that it was slowly closing up, getting smaller and smaller as the cloud continued moving away from her. She got near the hole and tried to pull it back open, panicking. If that hole closed, would she ever be able to get back home? She tried to climb in, but it was too late. The hole closed completely, and the pieces of cloud that tore off in her hands floated away like dandelion seeds after a wish has been made. She stopped flapping and simply floated, watching helplessly as the cloud joined with another and made a bigger cloud. What am I going to do now? Sarah said out loud. Hold perfectly still, a voice behind her said, and Sarah let out a little yelp of fright. She started to turn around, but the voice got louder. "Do not move," it boomed. Sarah froze. She was beginning to think this hadn't been such a good idea after all, when a giant bag made of white feathers slipped over her head and closed off at her feet. A moment later, the bag turned over, and so did she. She barely managed to right herself before it took off. "Excuse me," she called. "But who are you and where are you taking me?" "My name is Dog's Body, and I am taking you where all intruders are taken, to the court of the Cloud Queen." "But Mr. Dog's Body, sir, I'm not an intruder. I came here in search of help." "Tell it to the Cloud Queen," Dog's Body said, and picked up speed. "Can you please just tell me if I'm enormous?" "Of course you are," Dog's Body shouted, and Sarah felt some small measure of relief. On and on they flew, and after a while Sarah began to consider that maybe this was the best thing that could have happened to her. After all, she had come to Orma's in search of someone who could help, and now she was apparently being taken to just such a person, a queen, no less. "Mr. Dog's Body, sir?" Sarah called through the feather bag. "Is the Cloud Queen the ruler of Ormus?" "You don't know much, do you?" "I don't know that." "Yes," he said. "She is. So now you do know it. And just in time, too. We're here." Sarah felt the bag land on something soft and springy. She waited for Dog's Body to open the bag, but he didn't. She could hear him talking with someone, but she couldn't make out what they were saying. A moment later, somebody poked her through the bag. "You in there. What's your name?" "Sarah. Sarah Steiner." She heard more muffled voices outside the bag, but she still couldn't make out what was being said. Not wanting to wait any longer, she dug into the bag until she found the top and ripped through it, tearing the feathers apart, making a hole big enough to climb through. As she stood up and pushed the bag down, she found herself standing on a cloud surrounded by other clouds. She heard whispers and gasps, but she couldn't see anyone or anything, for that matter, other than clouds. She blinked and stared, and at last she began to see small movements in the clouds. Then she realized they weren't clouds, they were people. One cloud separated from the others and floated toward her. As it got closer, Sarah saw that it was a woman with long flowing cloud hair and pale cloud skin and a cloud dress as blindingly white as snow under sunshine. "My," the cloud woman said, "you're a spirited one, aren't you? Who are you?" Sarah said, as whole rows of cloud people came forward, cloud men with flowing cloud beards and cloud suits as white as the dresses of the cloud women with them. "I am the Cloud Queen," said the one who had spoken, and now Sarah noticed the woman had a small cloud crown on top of her flowing cloud hair. "And you, Sarah Steiner," the Cloud Queen said, "I suspect you must be the young relative of one of the record keepers. Is that not true? Tell us, how did you get here?" "Through a secret door behind the bookcase in my brother's bedroom." The Cloud Queen shook her head. "Just like that?" she asked. Sarah began to feel nervous. The Cloud Queen seemed to be getting mad. "I don't understand what you mean," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "Speak up," said the Cloud Queen. "I don't understand," Sarah repeated louder. "That much is obvious," the Cloud Queen said. "Because, young lady, if you understood anything at all, you would not be here." I'll have Dog's body return you. We will make you fall asleep, and when you wake up you will be back in your bed with the feeling that this was all a dream. The Cloud Queen started to turn away. Wait, please, Sarah said. I came here for help. The Cloud Queen stopped and turned around. What do you mean? Help with what? Something terrible has happened, Sarah said. She was so afraid of making the Cloud Queen mad that she was whispering again. The Cloud Queen frowned. Did you say that something terrible has happened? Sarah nodded. Well, you see, I didn't come here to Orma's, first. When Sarah said this, a murmur rose among the Cloud people. Silence, the Cloud Queen hissed, and they all did exactly as she said. Go on. I went behind my bookcase. The one in my room, That one took me to a different place. One called Scritopia. A collective gasp burst from the Cloud people. But the Cloud Queen said nothing. Instead, she just stared at Sarah, waiting. Sarah didn't know what to do except continue. I'm afraid Balthazar tricked me. He pretended to be a cat, and I brought him home with me. The Cloud Queen closed her eyes. Sarah kept on. He got into penumbra, she said, and the Cloud people began to shriek. Dog's body, the Cloud Queen said. Clear the court at once, then wait outside. Chapter 28. The Taste of Sunlight. Dog's body, who Sarah now saw was a cloud person like all the others, did as the Cloud Queen ordered. As he led all the Cloud people through a door in the clouds, the Cloud Queen took Sarah to a bench made of clouds, and they sat down together. Now, child, said the Cloud Queen, tell me the whole story from the beginning to the end. Sarah did so as quickly as she could. She was growing anxious. Not just because Balthazar might be going through with his plan, and not just because she was slowly turning into a sentinel, but because she couldn't stop thinking about all the people who were depending on her. Phoebe and Edgar and Jeb and Billy and Grandma Winnie and all the dead people wandering around outside. Well, the Cloud Queen said when Sarah was finished. That is quite a story, the likes of which I can honestly say I have never heard. I'm sorry, Sarah said. As am I. From what you have told me, a terrible mistake has been made. What do you mean? Well, first of all, no record keeper is supposed to go to Penumbra without leaving the job to someone else. It sounds like your grandmother wasn't prepared for that. The Cloud Queen shook her head. I suppose it's amazing we don't have more problems like this. It's too bad I can't do anything to help you. Sarah felt like she had been pinched hard. What do you mean you can't help me? Just that, I'm afraid. As your friend Jeb told you, we are all forbidden to cross over. You should not have gone to Scritopia, and your grandmother should not have told you to come here. Every time someone crosses over, the balance is upset. Not just in our world here, but in Penumbra and Scritopia, and in your world as well. I don't understand. The Cloud Queen nodded. Everything was once like this, she said, waving her arm. Even all those who are now in Scritopia. Sarah's eyes widened with disbelief. You mean Balthazar was once a cloud person like you? Yes, the Cloud Queen said. But he and Leto and Tantalus and a bunch of others tried to take over. They didn't like the way I ran things. They thought they could do better. So they started a rebellion. Only, they didn't realize what they were doing until it was too late. What were they doing? making darkness. Their rebellion created Scatopia, and their confusion about right and wrong has locked them all away in it. That's why Balthazar can't find a way out on his own. Oh, Sarah said, feeling even worse now. That's why we're here and they're there. It's also why Balthazar wants to bring some of the sleeping souls who belong to Ormuz with him. He believes they will give him light. Won't they? Not in the way he thinks. He believes if he has something there that belongs here, he will make Scatopia a little bit like Ormuz. But he doesn't see that his lying and thievery make that impossible. Sarah nodded. So what am I going to do? That you will have to decide for yourself. The Cloud Queen stood and called Dog's Body in. But wait, Sarah said. Aren't you worried about what might happen if Balthazar does what he's trying to do? The Cloud Queen shook her head. You are the one who should be worried. If he succeeds in upsetting the balance by getting some souls from Penumbra, then the doors will open and stay open, and your world will eventually become one with Scatopia. Sarah felt a wave of nausea wash through her like cold water. What will happen to you? Nothing, said the Cloud Queen. We've done nothing wrong. Sarah felt frantic. There had to be something she could do. What about the moonlight I drank? She asked. Do you know how I can stop from turning into one of those sentinels? The Cloud Queen smiled. That, she said, I can help you with. Come here. Sarah rushed forward, and the Cloud Queen opened a door in the floor. Beneath it was a shimmering pool, shining so brightly that Sarah held her hand up to her eyes. Take a sip of this. What is it? Sarah asked. Sunlight, of course. The only cure for moonlight. Sarah stepped forward and got to her knees. She dipped her hand in the pool and was surprised to find that it was warm. In spite of everything, she smiled as she scooped up some of the sunlight and brought it to her mouth. The warmth was comforting as it swished in her mouth and went down her throat. She felt it spreading through her stomach in waves, pushing away the nausea and the fear. In fact, she suddenly felt better than she had since she couldn't remember when. Overcome with excitement, she dipped her hand toward the pool again, but the Cloud Queen stopped her. No, dear, the Cloud Queen said. That's all you need. Please, said Sarah. Just one more sip. In answer, the Cloud Queen closed the door. Sarah dropped her hand, disappointed but still feeling energized and hopeful. Am I really cured? She asked. Essentially. It will take a bit for the sunlight to push all the moonlight out. But as long as you don't drink any more moonlight, then you should be fine. Sarah shook her head. Believe me, I'm not drinking any more moonlight. Good, said the Cloud Queen. Are you ready to go back now? Sarah nodded, then said quickly, Can I ask one more favor? What is it now? Can you not put me to sleep and make me think this was all a dream? I need to remember everything you said. The Cloud Queen considered her request for a long moment, then nodded once. Thank you, Sarah said. Away, then, the Cloud Queen said, lifting her arm as if in blessing. May the water and light follow you. Sarah waved as the Cloud Queen lowered her arm, turned, and strolled across the courtyard. Sarah waited until she was gone, then looked at Dog's Body. Do you have to put me in the bag again? I suppose not, he said. Good, Sarah said. Dog's Body bent over and picked her up. A moment later, they shot into the sky. As they flew away from the courtyard, Sarah looked over her shoulder and saw that they had been in the courtyard of a giant castle built of clouds. Towers and turrets and walls rose up as far as she could see, glittering and white. The farther away they flew, the more of the castle she could see, until she realized she could not see its top or its sides. It seemed to Sarah that the cloud castle was bigger even than all of New York City, and she had seen that from the window of an airplane this summer before. She felt Dog's body diving down, and she faced forward just as they landed on a cloud. He set her down and pointed at a large hole in front of them. "Right through there," he said. "But hurry now, before it closes up." Sarah could hardly believe it. "You mean you know all the places to get through?" "Of course," said Dog's body. "But I don't understand." "We can know because we will never go through them." Sarah nodded slowly. "And Balthazar can't because he will." Dog's body nodded. "Thank you, Dog's body," she said. "And tell the Cloud Queen the same thing." He nodded, and she dove into the hole. Chapter 29. Another way through. Sarah hadn't realized how bright Orma's was until she crawled into the darkness at the end of the tunnel. When she pulled herself over the ledge and into the secret room behind Billy's bookcase, she sat still, blinking her eyes, getting used to the dark. After a moment, she got to her feet and went into Billy's room. It was just as she had left it. In fact, Billy and Phoebe were still there. "What are you guys doing?" she whispered at them. "I told you to go stand guard in my room." Billy and Phoebe looked at each other. "That's where we're going," Phoebe said. "What are you doing?" "I thought you were going to see if you could get help." Sarah opened her mouth to say that she had already done that when she remembered what Edgar had told her about time standing still. She smiled excitedly. "Of course," she said. "That's exactly what happened." "What happened?" "Come with me," Sarah said. "I'll explain it to you on our way back to Scatopia." Billy and Bee nodded and followed her across the dark hallway to her room. She held on to the journal and the key as she told Billy and Phoebe about Edgar's time theory and how her visit to Ormus proved it. She also told them about her meeting with the Cloud Queen and how the Queen had said it was up to her to stop Balthazar. "All of us, you mean?" Phoebe said. "It's up to all of us." Sarah nodded. "Thank you, Phoebe," she said. "I just wish there were something I could do," Grandma Winnie said. "But you've already helped," Sarah said. "The trip to Orma's was the answer to everything. Go downstairs and tell all those poor souls outside that it won't be much longer before they'll be let into Penumbra." Grandma Winnie's eyes brightened. "I knew you were the one," she said. "What does that mean?" Sarah asked. "The new record keeper," Grandma Winnie said. "Your mother never understood what I was trying to tell her. She had other ideas." "You mean she was supposed to take over?" Grandma Winnie nodded. "I had hoped so, anyway. But what will we do?" "Mom and Dad are going to sell the house, and then we're going back to California." "Not if I can help it." Sarah smiled as Grandma Winnie winked at her, and then went through the door and was gone. Billy held out his hand, palm down, and Sarah knew at once what he wanted. She put her hand on top of his, also palm down. Phoebe looked at both of them and then leaned forward so he could put the hook at the tip of his wing on top of both of their hands. "All in?" Sarah asked. "Yes," Phoebe said. Now let's get back to work. Sarah nodded and stood. She took the journal and the key and shoved them under her mattress. Then she told Billy to stick close by her side as the three of them went behind the bookcase. The hole was too small for all of them to jump through together. They would have to go one at a time. Sarah told BB to go first so that he could park himself at the exit and stop her and Billy from falling to the ground, where Lefty and the Sentinel could get them. Phoebe agreed and jumped into the hole. "Ugh," he said from the darkness below. Sarah leaned over the edge and peered down. "Phoebe, are you okay?" "Yes," he said, his voice muffled. "What is it?" "What's happened?" "It's blocked." "What do you mean?" "I mean the tunnel has been stopped up with something. Rocks, I think." Sarah put her hand over her mouth. The only explanation she could think of was that Balthazar had already found another way through from Penumbra. He had found another house with 3 doors and had used it to start transferring the sleeping souls. Knowing that Sarah might try to come through this way, he had ordered the passage blocked to stop her. Sarah called Phoebe out of the tunnel and explained her suspicions. "Come on," she said. "Where are we going?" "We have to find another way through." "What about the basement? Couldn't we go through the door to Penumbra and find where Balthazar went through?" "No," Sarah said. "Balthazar probably thinks that's what we'll do when we find this passage blocked. He probably has sentinels waiting for us there. We need to find a completely new way through." "But how?" "Back to Orma's." Billy and Phoebe went out ahead of her and Sarah started to follow, but then stopped short. "Oops," she said. "I almost forgot." She bent down to pick up the glass case with Jeb's face in it, but she couldn't find it. Phoebe poked his head back through. "Aren't you coming?" "In a minute," Sarah said. "Pull the bookcase out." "I need some more light." Phoebe did, but even with the extra light, Sarah still couldn't find Jeb's face. "What's wrong?" Phoebe asked. "I left something here. A glass box." "Oh, that," Phoebe said. "I hope it wasn't important." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "It's very important." "Do you know what happened to it?" Phoebe backed up slowly, now looking very worried and upset. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said. "But when I was climbing through earlier, I knocked it down the tunnel with my wing. I was too scared about the giant hand and the guy with the head in a sling to try to get it back." Sarah's stomach dropped still further. Now that the tunnel was blocked, they couldn't even check to see if Lefty or the Sentinel had found it. What was it anyway? Sarah could see how upset Phoebe was, and she also knew that what had happened was an accident. "Let's worry about it later," she said, and went into her room. With Phoebe's help, she closed the bookcase back up. Then all 3 of them returned to Billy's room and slid through the tunnel into Orma's. Just like before, as soon as they slid through, Dog's body was there with his feather bag. "You," he said. "What are you doing here again?" "Who are they?" "We need your help, Dog Body," Sarah said. "You need to take us to another way over." Dog's Body shook his head. "You know I can't do that. But you're not the one going through. It'll just be us." Dog's Body stared at her. "Please," Sarah said. "There's no time to explain everything that's happened. I think Balthazar has already found another way through, and if we can't get back to Scatopia, we'll never be able to stop him." I need to ask the Cloud Queen, he said. There's no time for that either. Dog's Body stared at her and she stared back, her eyes pleading with him. Please, she went on, can't you help us just this little bit? So BB can get his name back and my brother can get his mouth back. At last Dog's Body nodded. This way, he said, and picked up Sarah and Billy. You, he said to BB, look like you don't need me to carry you, right? Right, BB said and flapped his wings. Dog's Body took off into the clouds, flying over some and under others until they reached a flat field of clouds with a small cloud hill in the middle. They landed on the hill and Dog's Body put Sarah and Billy down. He pointed at a hole. That's the next closest way through. Sarah thanked him and then pushed Billy and BB through ahead of her. She took one last look at Orma's, then blew Dog's Body a kiss and climbed in. The darkness at the end of the tunnel was so complete that she didn't know which way to go. She thrust her hands in front of her, waving them around, trying to find something solid. Over here, BB whispered, and Sarah followed his voice. I think this is the way through. Sarah pushed against the wall and it creaked. Let me try, BB said, and Sarah stepped aside. He threw his weight into it and the wall opened up. The bookcase, just like in Sarah's and Billy's rooms, slid forward and fell with a thunderous crash. Oops, BB said. The three of them froze, staring at a room that was exactly the same as Billy's room, only it wasn't Billy's room. And the old man standing in front of them was nothing like Billy. Oh my, the old man said with a foreign accent. I've been waiting for something like this to happen. Sarah looked at Billy and BB, then back at the old man. I'm sorry, she said. It's my fault, said BB. I shouldn't have pushed so hard. The old man stepped toward them. That bookcase is the least of our problems, he said. I'm guessing that you're Sarah Steiner? Sarah nodded. How did you know that? A message went out yesterday, he said. You're from the house in Pennsylvania, aren't you? Isn't that where we are? The old man shook his head. This house is in London. England, Sarah said. For a moment, she didn't believe him. But then she remembered what the Cloud Queen had told her. Of course, she said, stepping forward and going to the window. These houses are all over the world, with record keepers like you living in them. That's what you are, right? The old man nodded. They warned us you might come through anywhere. And they said if I see you, I'm supposed to stop you. If you stop us, Sarah said, Balthazar will succeed for sure. Who? Balthazar, Sarah said. The king of Scitopia. If you don't let us go back there, the whole world will go dark. That's already happening because of what you've done, the old man shouted. I can't let you leave. I can't let you make things worse than they already are. You'll have to, Sarah said. Hold him, BB. For a moment, BB looked surprised. But then he realized what Sarah was telling him and he moved forward quickly. He spread his wings wide and wrapped the old man in them, clicking his hooks together for the tightest grip possible. Let me go, the old man said, struggling to get free. In a minute, Sarah said, and flung the bedroom door open. She saw immediately that the house was identical to the one they were living in. The other bedroom, just like hers, was across from the one they were in. This way, she said. Billy ran ahead of her. Phoebe waddled after, the old man still squirming in his wings. Billy grabbed the edge of the bookcase and pulled it from the wall. Sarah smiled. "Thanks, Billy," she said. "We better let Phoebe go first, just in case." "What about him?" Phoebe asked. "Do you see you can't stop us?" Sarah asked the old man, and he nodded. "All right, then," Sarah said. "Let him go." Phoebe opened his wings, and the old man gasped for breath. Quickly, the three of them hurried into the dark space together and found the ledge at the end. Phoebe jumped. Then Sarah helped Billy over and jumped in after him. Chapter 30. In the Green Desert. When they came out the other side, Sarah saw nothing but sand stretching for miles. She picked up a handful and let it run through her fingers. It glinted green in the dim light, and Sarah smiled. "It's green," she said. "This must be the Green Desert. Now all we have to do is find the Blummies." She pulled out the map Edgar had given her, but it was no help. It only showed how Crooked Canyon connected the Green Desert with the moonlit sea. "Phoebe," she said, "you're going to have to take us up." "Both of you?" he asked. "Do you think you can?" "I don't know. We could try." Sarah nodded and helped Billy onto his back, then climbed on the other side. Phoebe flapped his wings and they took off. But as soon as they were in the air, they veered to one side and fell to the ground. Sarah helped Billy to his feet. "I guess you'll have to go alone," she said. "Go where?" "Up there. Try to find out where we are. Find the Blummies." "What'll you two do?" "Wait here, I guess." "What else can we do?" Phoebe nodded. "I'll come back as soon as I can," he said, and took off into the dark sky. Sarah didn't know why, but for some reason she expected him to fly to her right. Instead, Phoebe flew to her left. She almost called out to him to change direction, but then knew that it wouldn't make much difference. After all, they had no idea where they were. Every direction would have to be checked. "Come on, Billy," she said. "We might as well sit down." They had waited for quite some time when Sarah heard a noise in the distance. She stood up and looked in the direction Phoebe had flown. But the noise was coming from behind her. She turned around and peered into the distance, searching the sky for any sign of Phoebe. Then a flash of light low on the horizon caught her eye and she adjusted her gaze. To see farther, she climbed onto a cluster of rocks and stood on her tiptoes. In the distance, she saw what looked like headlights, but they were blue. At once she realized that they were cold fire torches and that this was the line of Cyclopes that had left the Black Iron prison in search of her. She assumed they were still on their way to the Blummies. She couldn't believe it had taken them so long to get this far. But as they grew nearer, she saw that the squat creatures were not alone. Between every two of them was a long pole with something tied to it. Although she couldn't tell what was tied to the poles, she guessed it must be captive Blummies. The one-eyed creatures had apparently already been to the Blummie camp and were now on their way back to the Black Iron prison. She heard a flapping behind her and whirled around as Phoebe landed. He was crying. "What is it, Phoebe?" she said. "What's wrong?" "It was terrible," he said. "I found the Blummies, all right. What's left of them, anyway. Those things attacked them and burned their houses down until there was nothing left. Then they took the few still alive and tied them to poles and carried them off. Sarah turned around and looked again at the marching line in the distance. They were moving away from them now, back to the black iron prison, where she was sure they would lock the Blemmies up with Edgar and Jeb. She sat down on the rocks. "There has to be something we can do," she said. "There has to be some other way that we just haven't thought of yet." "There isn't," Phoebe said. "It's over. We can't stop them." "Don't say that." "But it's true. I saw what they did to those poor Blemmies. We don't stand a chance." "What are you saying?" Sarah asked. "You're going to leave? You're going back to your hole in Crooked Canyon to sit there by yourself, always wondering what your real name is?" Phoebe's shoulders slumped. "No," he said. "You know I can't do that." "All right, then," Sarah said, and stood up. "How far is the Blemmie camp from here?" "Not far," Phoebe said. "There's a ridge over there, and the desert drops into a kind of crater." "Lead the way," she said. "But why?" "Because I want to see it for myself." The three of them started across the desert. Within a few moments, the darkness had swallowed them up, leaving only their footprints behind. When they reached the ridge and looked down into the crater, Sarah saw why Phoebe had been crying. The Blemmie camp was a wreck, riddled with small fires still burning, flickering blue in the dark, sending up smoke the color of the sky. "So," Phoebe said, "you've seen it for yourself. Now what?" Sarah had hoped to come up with some ideas on their way to the camp, but she hadn't. Faced with the destruction below her, she felt even less able to think of anything except to wish that she could have done something to prevent it. She heaved a sigh and was about to tell BB. She had no idea what to do when a thin voice floated to them across the distance. "Help," it said. "Did you hear that?" Sarah said. Phoebe and Billy both nodded. "Please," the voice cried out again. "Help me." A new sense of purpose flooded Sarah, and she started down the side of the crater as fast as she could. "Wait, Sarah," Phoebe called after her. "What if it's a trap?" Too late to think about that now, Sarah decided. She was already in the open. If guards from the Black Iron prison had remained behind in the hopes of still catching her, they were about to succeed. Sarah stopped at the edge of the camp and looked around. "Where are you?" she called out. "Over here," the voice said, and Sarah saw something new in movement that she had taken for shadows in the blue firelight. She rushed forward and saw a Blemmie, his legs trapped under a collapsed rock wall. He was a strange creature, all right, with his head below his shoulders, in his chest, just as Balthazar had told her. She knelt beside him and tried to lift the wall but couldn't. "I'm not strong enough by myself," she told the Blemmie, then got to her feet. She was about to call out for Billy and BB, but they were already there. "Maybe if my friends help me and we all work together," she said. Phoebe and Billy nodded, and the three of them each grabbed part of the wall and lifted. Sarah could hardly believe it when the rock slab moved enough for the Blemmie to pull himself out. Once he was clear, they dropped the wall and it thumped to the ground. "Thank you," the Blemmie said. "My name is Anonymous. You're Sarah. You have come here to ask our help in fighting Balthazar." Sarah frowned. "That's right. How did you know that?" "We Blemmies can read minds," Anonymous said. He laughed, then winced in pain. You know that we tried to defeat Balthazar before and failed. He cannot be defeated unless... Anonimo tried to sit up, but couldn't. So Sarah knelt quickly to help him. Unless what? She said. Unless you have the Undoer. The Undoer? What's that? Only those who have seen it know. They say it has the power to undo what has been done. We don't even know if it's real. Maybe it's not. Legend says that Balthazar came into power because he took it from Tantalus. Who? He was the king of Scatopia before Balthazar, Anonymous said, coughing thickly. Leto was the king before Tantalus, and so on, each one of them taking the throne only after they got the Undoer. It's what we Blemmies hoped to do the first time around. I was to be made king. Do you know where we can find the Undoer? No. If I had it, I would never let anyone know where it was. To risk its discovery would mean to risk being dethroned. How big is it? Anonymous shrugged. Some say it's bigger than the Sentinels. Some say it's small enough to hold in your hand. Sarah stood up. She looked at Billy and BB. It's our only hope. We have to find the Undoer. But Sarah, BB, said, didn't you hear him? We don't even know what it looks like. We'll never be able to find it. Not without help. Who can help us? Jeb. He's lived as Balthazar's servant for 2 years. Anonymous' eyes brightened. And he is now a friend of yours. Sarah nodded. Anonymous' eyes dimmed. But he is in the Black Iron prison, he said, obviously still reading Sarah's mind. Then it is hopeless. No one escapes from the Black Iron prison. I did. Anonymous stared at her. I see you climbing through the smoke vent from the blue suite. Sarah nodded. I'll think about the rest of it later. Right now, the most important thing to do is to get back there and see if Jeb can tell me where to find the Undoer. Sarah looked at Billy, then at Anonymous. But we can't all go. BB can't carry more than one of us, and Anonymous is in no condition to travel. Not yet. Can you take care of my brother while we go find the Undoer? Billy pointed at himself and then at Anonymous. Sarah laughed. You'll take care of him? She asked. Billy nodded and everyone laughed. Good enough for me, Sarah said. Come on, BB. Let's fly. Chapter 31. Back to the Black Iron prison. BB stepped into the open and stretched his wings. Sarah climbed onto his back, and a moment later, they lifted into the dark and smoky sky. As they rose higher and higher, Sarah glanced back at the small flickering blue fires. They looked like stars at the bottom of the ocean. Which way? BB called. Sarah pointed in the direction that the Cyclops had headed, and BB picked up speed. They soon spotted the flat, bright moonlit sea, and against it, the shadow of the Black Iron prison. Far to the left, Sarah saw the line of marching one-eyed creatures, their torches like a broken sapphire necklace against the shadow-stained green sand. She was glad to see they hadn't made it all the way back yet. She asked Phoebe to fly faster. They soon swooped low over the roof of the Black Iron prison, and Sarah pointed at the smoke vent she had used for her escape. Phoebe pulled his wings back, and they landed right next to it. Sarah got down from BS back and peered onto the platform below. It was empty. Then she remembered that Edgar had said they would send everybody to search for her. She didn't think he really meant everyone, but she looked into the distance anyway and quickly counted the torches. She stopped at 30. Maybe they really had sent everyone and the Black Iron prison was empty except for the prisoners. Change of plans, Sarah said. Get us down to that door. Phoebe nodded and Sarah held on as he flapped up, then swooped down, landing on the cold, flat iron platform. She jumped off Phoebe and went to the door. It was open. Hurry, she said. Follow me. Sarah knew she shouldn't be afraid. Still, just being back inside the Black Iron prison was enough to make her shudder. At first, she couldn't remember how to get to the blue suite, but then she remembered that around every corner, the one-eyed guards had gone down the stairs. Sarah tried to move more quickly, but BB was having a hard time on the narrow stairs. Go back outside and wait, she said. If the guards reach the prison walls and I'm not back, scream. Phoebe nodded and turned around. Sarah hurried onward, deeper into the gloom. When at last she reached the door to the blue suite, she pounded on it. Jeb? Edgar? Are you still in there? Sarah, Jeb called to her through the door. Is that really you? Of course it's me. What's going on? Have you brought the Blemmies? No, just me. No time for anything but to get you two out of here. I'm alone. What about Edgar? They took him somewhere else, Jeb said. I don't know where. Sarah backed away from the door. She took the key down from its hook on the wall and opened the door to the blue suite. Jeb came out smiling as much as he could with only half a face. I can't believe you really made it, he said. Then he looked at her and asked, Where's my face? Sarah looked at the floor. Slight complication, she said. Oh no, Jeb whispered. I trusted you. I know you did, but it wasn't my fault. There was an accident. Jeb hung his head and turned away slowly. Do you have any idea where it is? I don't think it matters, Sarah said. Of course it matters, Jeb said. His face was suddenly as angry as it had been in the moment before he had spit in the guard's face. Not if we have the Undoer. The what? The Undoer. I don't know what it looks like. It could be big or it could be small. What are you talking about? Jeb asked. It's what makes Balthazar king. It's part of what gives him his power. It can undo anything that he has done. Jeb lifted his head slowly, the anger draining away. Really? Sarah nodded. Did you ever see Balthazar with it? Jeb shrugged. What does it look like? I don't know. Jeb thought for a minute. Well, one time, I came into the main room when I hadn't been called. I saw Balthazar playing with something that looked like a pen made of glass. At first he seemed very upset that I had seen him with it. Then he said he could make it as if I had never seen it if he wanted to. He waved the glass pen around for a minute, but nothing happened. Then he laughed and told me to get out. Do you think that could be what you're talking about? Sarah nodded. Do you know where he keeps it? Yes. A few months later, I was looking for a way to open the box with my face in it. I found the glass pen. I thought he had lost it, but then I realized he had hidden it there. In the cabin? Jeb nodded. Then we have to hurry. Come on. What about Edgar? We'll have to come back for him. The guards are almost here. Sarah ran back upstairs and Jeb followed. When they got back to the platform, Phoebe was gone. Oh, no, Sarah gasped. Where is he? Who? Phoebe. Who's that? A friend. I met him after I left here. Sarah tilted her head back, searching the sky above. Why are you looking up there? Because Phoebe can fly. What? He's a bat. A giant bat. Sort of. The part that isn't a bat is a boy. You're not making much sense. It will in a minute, Sarah said, and ran toward the wall. She found a ladder and climbed to the outer ledge of the building. When she looked down, she saw guards clustered at the base of the black iron prison. Phoebe was circling them, swooping down, picking up rocks and dropping them. He was doing it, Sarah now realized, to keep the guards from getting back inside. But she didn't need him to do that anymore. Phoebe, she shouted. He pulled out of a dive bomb maneuver and flapped up to land near them. The guards, sensing their opportunity, swarmed through the gate into the prison. This way, Sarah shouted, and ran to the wall overlooking the moonlit sea. Jeb looked over the edge and down. What now? Jump, Sarah said. Are you crazy? Jeb asked. It's how I got away before. And if I can do it, you can. Jeb looked over the edge again and shook his head. I don't think so. Sarah laughed. What are you laughing at? Jeb asked. It's just that when I was up here before, I wished you were with me so that we could jump together. Now you're chickening out. I'm not chicken, Jeb said. Then let's go, Sarah said, grabbing Jeb's hand and pulling as hard as she could. He screamed as they sailed through the air and splashed into the moonlit sea. Sarah paddled to the surface, blowing the moonlight from her mouth. She looked around for Jeb. When she didn't see him pop up anywhere, she grew frantic. Phoebe swooped down behind her and skimmed across the surface of the sea. Where is he? I don't know, Sarah said. I've got to go down and look for him. We don't have much time, Phoebe said. As soon as the guards realize where you went, they'll come back down. Sarah nodded and turned over, diving down through the moonlight, scooping through it, searching for Jeb. Then she saw a black shape floating ahead and she paddled faster. By the time she reached him, her lungs were about to burst. She grabbed Jeb's leg and pulled him toward the surface. But he was too heavy. She couldn't make it. She had to get back to the surface, even if it meant going alone. Just then, a shadow dove in front of her. Phoebe grabbed Jeb and swam back toward the top. Sarah paddled as hard as she could and broke through the surface just as Phoebe and Jeb did. She sucked in deep breaths of air as Phoebe flew in a circle over her, still holding Jeb. Then she saw the guards on the ledge, looking down and pointing. Sarah knew it wouldn't take them long to reorganize and make their way down. Take Jeb to shore, she shouted to Phoebe, then come back and get me. Without answering her, Phoebe flew off fast as Sarah paddled toward the beach. She looked over her shoulder and saw the guards leaving the ledge. She was thankful that none of them had enough courage to jump in after her. Before she even reached the beach, the first guards came through the door at the base of the black iron prison and ran across the sand. Phoebe came just in time, swooping down to pluck her from the sea like a bird of prey with a fish. She caught her breath as they darted into the dark sky, the moonlight streaming from her body, the guards' shouts of anger growing fainter. Chapter 32. Searching for the Undoer. Phoebe set Sarah down next to Jeb, who was still unconscious. Jeb, she said as she rolled him over and started shaking him. "Wake up, Jeb. Wake up." He coughed and moonlight came out of his mouth. A wave of worry swept over her. She hoped he hadn't swallowed any. When he finally blinked and sat up, Sarah heaved a sigh of relief. "Sarah," Jeb asked weakly, "are we dead?" Sarah laughed, shaking her head. Without thinking, she reached out and pulled Jeb to her, hugging him tightly. But her happiness didn't last long. "Look," Phoebe shouted, and Sarah turned around. The guards had shifted course and were now coming straight toward them. They weren't very far away either. Sarah got to her feet and pulled Jeb up. "Phoebe, take Jeb, fly ahead and put him down, then come back for me. We'll have to do it a couple of times to get ahead of the guards, but it's the only way." "It's not the only way," Phoebe said. "Grab onto my feet. We tried that before." "You can't do it." "We have to try again." Sarah looked over her shoulder. The guards were much closer than she had realized. They were bearing down fast, so close that she could see their eyes gleaming in the light of their cold fire torches. "Now!" Phoebe shouted and took off into the sky. Sarah and Jeb each reached up and grabbed a foot as Phoebe zoomed overhead, jerking them into the sky just in time. The guards were so close Sarah felt their hands on her legs and feet, trying to grab hold. She screamed, pulling her feet up as Phoebe flapped his wings harder still, and they rose into the sky a bit higher. Just when she thought they were actually going to get away, they suddenly veered to the left. Sarah was certain they would crash back to the ground. But Phoebe kept flapping, and in a few more moments, they were high enough for him to glide. Sarah heaved another sigh of relief. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up," Phoebe said, and Sarah looked over her shoulder at the ground below. Their distance from the guards was increasing fast, but the guards weren't giving up. They were still coming after them. "Just a little bit longer," Sarah said. Phoebe kept flying until the torches were like pinpoints behind them. He started to descend, and as they neared the ground, Sarah and Jeb both let go. Phoebe landed hard and immediately collapsed to the ground and rolled over, breathing heavily. Sarah got up and ran to him. Jeb followed her slowly. "You did it, Phoebe. You did it." Phoebe smiled between deep breaths. He tried to answer with words but couldn't, so he nodded instead. Sarah pulled out the map Edgar had given her and unfolded it. As she had hoped, it showed that the edge of the Forest of Shadows was just ahead. She didn't know exactly how far it was, but at least she could tell they were headed in the right direction. "We've got to keep moving. We'll be safe once we get to the Forest of Shadows. I'm sure of it." "And what about the Sentinels?" Jeb asked. "If Balthazar has already found another way through from Penumbra, then I'm sure he doesn't care much about us. As far as he's concerned, he already got what he wanted. He doesn't think we can stop him." "He may be right." "No," Sarah said. "I won't let him get away with it." She went to Phoebe and helped him up. "Phoebe," she said, "you need to fly ahead of us. Make sure we keep going in the right direction. See how close we are. Keep looking for sentinels or anything else that might get in our way." "Wait," Jeb said. "I'm pretty sure Balthazar's cabin is far from the Black Iron prison. It could take us hours to walk all the way back. By then it really could be too late." Why don't I just tell you where what did you call it? The Undoer? Right, the Undoer. Why don't I just tell you where it is and Phoebe can fly you to the cabin instead? Sarah shook her head. You're the one who's seen it. Phoebe should take you to get it. But what about you? I'll keep going this way, Sarah said. As soon as you find the Undoer, you bring it back to me. And what then? Jeb asked. We don't even know how to use it. That doesn't matter right now. As long as we have it, at least we can be sure that Balthazar won't be able to use it. Then Sarah smiled as something else occurred to her. Maybe we can even use it to force Balthazar to do what we want. All right, Jeb said, and faced Phoebe. Are you ready? Phoebe nodded tiredly, turning around so that Jeb could climb onto his back. Sarah waved as they took off, then followed them as quickly as she could on foot. In no time, they melted into the darkness, shadows swallowed by shadows. Sarah put her head down and picked up her pace. She thought about all the things that would have to be undone once they had the Undoer. She would have to put Jeb's face together, get Edgar out of the Black Iron prison, restore the Blemmy camp, give Billy his mouth back, make BB a normal boy again, and, of course, send the sleeping souls back to Penumbra, if indeed Balthazar had really stolen any. The last thing she would undo was her visit to Scatopia. Then she could keep the Undoer and ensure that Balthazar's power would be incomplete. Jeb was right, though. None of them knew how to use the Undoer. Sarah tried to think who could help them with that. She knew that Balthazar certainly wouldn't tell her, even if she could find out where he was and ask him. Anonimo didn't know how to use it, even though he had planned to get it. He wasn't even sure it was real. The only people who would know how to use it, she realized, were those who had used it before. Anonimo had mentioned other kings, like Tantalus and Leto. Sarah wondered if they were still alive. She supposed that if they were, they would most likely be in the Black Iron prison, and she shuddered at the thought of going back there again. Sarah was thinking so hard about these things that she almost didn't see the gaping hole in front of her. At the last possible moment, she stopped herself short and pulled back. As she did, she stumbled and started to fall backward. Pinwheeling her arms, she threw herself sideways along the edge of the hole. Grabbing at the ground, she barely managed to hold on. Carefully, she pulled herself away from the edge. Once she was clear, she climbed back to her feet and turned around. The hole wasn't just a hole, it was a gigantic canyon of darkness that stretched almost as far as she could see. She would have to follow the edge to find a way around it. She decided to head to her left, toward the moonlit sea. After 10 minutes of following the canyon's edge, Sarah realized she was way out of line with her original path. This meant that when BB returned, he would have a hard time finding her. She decided she should just go back to where she had started. But when she did, she saw a thin line of glowing blue torches in the distance. She couldn't believe the guards had caught up with her so quickly. She looked around, trying to figure out what she could do to avoid capture. The most obvious answer also seemed to be the most difficult. She had to hide in the black chasm. She went to the edge and peered over. What little she could see was very steep. In a few spots, however, she saw enough rocky outcroppings to make her believe she could climb down and bury herself in the shadows until the guards had passed. She took one last glance over her shoulder to make sure they weren't close enough to see her, then climbed into the chasm, lowering herself into the shadows as carefully as she could. In a few moments, she heard the guards tramping over the black sand, kicking some of it over the edge. When they passed Sarah, the sand fell on her like stinging rain. Some of it got into her eyes, and she rubbed them furiously. Just when she thought it couldn't get any worse, some of the sand got into her nose and mouth, and she felt a violent sneeze clawing its way out of her. Before she could stop it, the sneeze exploded from her. She froze. So did the guards. Chapter 33. The tables are turned. Sarah dared herself to look up. She saw the glow of their torches just over the chasm's edge and heard several of the creatures speaking in harsh whispers. Then one of them called for quiet. The glow brightened as they all moved toward the edge in a line and looked down. They lowered their torches slowly, and Sarah watched in terror as the shadows around her melted away. When at last the cold blue light reached her, she could think of nothing else to do but scream at the top of her lungs. To her surprise, the piercing shriek she let out so frightened the guards that the one nearest to her stumbled and fell. He dropped his torch as he made a frantic attempt to grab onto something, anything, but he missed, and as he plummeted into the pit, Sarah looked down. The chasm was so dark that he vanished from sight almost instantly. His torch, however, continued glowing even as it got smaller and smaller. Sarah was still screaming when she faced the edge again. The other guards were crowding in, pointing at Sarah and shouting. Several of them began working together, holding on to each other to form a chain so they could reach her. Sarah didn't know which way to go. She screamed yet again, and just then, a black shape appeared, knocking into the guard at the top of the chain, toppling him over. The rest went with him, a half-dozen guards in all, tumbling down the way the first one had gone. Sarah flattened herself against the chasm wall as they whooshed past her. She heard more confused shouts above, and when she looked up, she saw the black shape gliding along the edge of the chasm, knocking the guards over like dominoes. As the shape passed directly overhead, she saw that it was BB, with Jeb hanging on underneath, using his feet to kick the guards in. As soon as it was clear, Sarah pulled herself up. She looked around. They had gotten every guard but one. He was running away from the chasm, back the way he had come. BB dropped Jeb and swerved sharply, tearing after the fleeing guard. The Cyclops looked over his shoulder, and when he saw BB bearing down on him, threw his torch down and ran faster. But BB was too fast, and he snatched the guard up in his claws and lifted him off the ground. Sarah watched as BB flew toward the chasm, obviously planning to drop the guard in with the others. "Wait," Sarah shouted. "Don't drop him in. We need him." Jeb grabbed Sarah. "Are you crazy? What are you talking about?" "I found the Undoer, and maybe he can help us with it." Jeb's eyes widened, and he shouted with Sarah, "Stop, BB. Don't drop him in." BB was already over the chasm when he banked and flew back toward them, the guard still in his claws. He dropped the guard on the ground next to them, then landed and started waddling back. The one-eyed creature shook with fear. "Please don't hurt me," he said, his voice weak and thin. "We won't," Sarah said, "if you help us." "Anything," the guard said. "Do you know where we can find Tantalus or Leto?" The guard's one eye widened. "Who are they?" Jeb asked. "Kings before Balthazar," Sarah said. "They know how to use the Undoer." Jeb smiled and Sarah looked back at the guard. But he was gone. Sarah heard something at her back, and when she turned around, she saw the guard running toward the chasm edge. "Stop him, Phoebe," she shouted. Phoebe flapped his wings and took off, but not before the guard reached the edge and jumped. As the creature vanished from sight, Phoebe dove after him. Sarah heard Phoebe squealing, using his radar to find the falling guard in the dark. She held her breath until she couldn't hold it anymore. When she finally let it out, Phoebe burst from the chasm, the guard squirming in his claws. Sarah and Jeb jumped for joy as he brought the guard back to them and dropped him on the ground. Sarah looked at Jeb. "So let's see it," she said. Jeb reached into his pocket. He took out the Undoer and held it up. It was just as he had described, like a pen made of glass. Only it was far more beautiful than Sarah had expected. Even in the darkness, it seemed to glow with a faintly shifting purple light. Sarah took it from Jeb's hand and showed it to the guard. "Do you know what this is?" she asked. The guard's lips trembled as he nodded. "Tell me," Sarah said. The Undoer," said the guard, his voice a mere whisper. Sarah nodded. "That's right. And we intend to use it so that Balthazar will be powerless again. That's why we need Tantalus or Leto. They know how to use it." "That's true," the guard said as he got to his feet and dusted himself off. "But talking to them won't do any good." "Why not?" "Because they can't answer. Balthazar took their mouths." Sarah's shoulders sagged. "Could they write down how to use it?" Jeb asked. The guard shook his head. "Balthazar took their hands, too. That's the way it is with everyone down there." "Down where?" "Where they are, in the bottom of the black iron prison." Sarah grimaced. No wonder the guard was so scared of Balthazar. She didn't even want to think about being locked up in the dark without a mouth or hands. "Oh, well," Jeb said. "I guess that's that." "No," Sarah said, facing Jeb angrily. "It can't be. We've got to think. There must be some other way we can find out how to use it." "You heard him," Jeb said. "They can't talk. They can't write. This whole thing has been hopeless from the beginning. I don't know why I ever thought anything would come of it. I let you get my hopes up, and now I see the way it really is." Sarah shook her head at Jeb. "You've been here too long," she said. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You're giving up too easily," she said. "Just when I need you the most. That's not what friends do." Jeb looked away, unable to meet Sarah's gaze, obviously ashamed. "Are you always this right?" "No," Sarah said. "I just happen to be this time. Now we've got to think. There has to be a way we can get what we need from Tantalus and Leto." Sarah closed her eyes and turned the problem over in her head. Then, instead of focusing on what the former kings couldn't do, she decided to think about what they could do. All at once it hit her, and she snapped her fingers. "Wait a second," she said. "Can they think?" "What?" Jeb said, completely confused. She grabbed the guard. "Can they think?" "I don't know," the guard said. "I guess so." She released him and faced Jeb and Phoebe, that's it. All we need to do is have them think about how to use the Undoer. And what good will that do? Because we'll have Anonimo with us, she said. He can read minds, remember? Jeb and Phoebe smiled. She told Phoebe to go to the Blemmy camp and tell Anonimo and Billy what had happened. Then lead them back to the Black Iron prison, Sarah said. We should get there about the same time you do. Phoebe nodded and took off. Sarah pushed the guard forward, then grabbed Jeb's hand and pulled him into the dark. Chapter 34. Using the Undoer. Sarah was right. They all reached the Black Iron prison at almost the same time. She was glad to see Anonimo and BB, but she was especially glad to see Billy, and she hugged him tightly before she realized what she was doing. He pushed her away, then tapped Anonimo on the shoulder and pointed at his own head. Anonimo laughed. He says, yuck. What's wrong with you? Sarah smiled. She faced Billy and shrugged. I guess I'm actually glad to see you, she said, as hard as that is to believe. Anonimo read Billy's mind again, then said, he says, whatever. Not much longer now, she whispered to him, and you'll have your mouth back. I promise. He nodded his understanding. Sarah faced the guard. Will you have any problem getting us in there? No, the guard said. I'm the only one left now. And with that, he turned and led them through the gate into the prison. Inside, the halls glowed with light from rows of cold fire torches. The guard wound through a series of narrowing passages and down steep staircases until at last he stopped outside a tall, thin door. This is it, he said. The bottom. They're all in there. Okay, Sarah said. Open it up. The guard nodded and took a key from around his neck. He slipped it into the lock and twisted it. The lock opened with a clunk. He pulled the handle and the door swung open with a shrieking creak. Rust dust floated down, glinting in the blue light like copper snow. Stale air wafted out at them from the darkness beyond. Behind her, Anonimo moaned, as if in pain. What is it? Sarah asked. So much suffering in there, he said. I don't think I can go in. Not unless some of them calm themselves. Sarah faced the darkness and shuddered. She was glad she couldn't read minds the way Anonimo could. I'll go in and bring them out, she said. She motioned for the guard to get a torch and come with her. Do you know their names? She asked him. The guard shook his head. No, I've only ever been in there once. That was enough. Give me the torch, then, Sarah said. I'll do it, a voice said, and Sarah whirled around to find Edgar standing in the doorway. She couldn't believe her eyes. Until now, she had really been having some doubts about whether or not they could make this work. Seeing Edgar, though, changed that. Now that he was here, she was sure they could do it. Edgar, she said. This is where they took you? Edgar nodded. Once they found out you were missing, they tried to make me tell where you had gone. When I refused, they put me in here. Sarah smiled and hugged him. Thank you, she said, for not telling. No, Edgar said. Thank you for coming to my rescue. I'm afraid they had in mind to take my mouth after all. He reached up and took a torch down from the wall. So who are you looking for? Tantalus, Jeb said. Or Leto, Sarah added. Edgar nodded and stepped back through the door. It looked to Sarah as if he were being swallowed by an iron giant's gaping, toothless mouth. They all waited in breathless silence, watching the dark. Sarah heard Edgar moving about, calling out for Tantalus and Leto. Every so often, she saw his torch flicker past. At last he emerged, dragging with him a poor pale creature with no mouth and no hands. His clothes were tattered and moth-eaten. His gray hair and bushy beard were like silver wire. His skin was so pale and pasty that Sarah thought it looked like cooked spaghetti. She wondered how long he had been in there, then decided she didn't want to know. He blinked at the light and stared at them all. "I'm fairly certain this is Leto," Edgar said. The old man nodded. Sarah stepped closer to him. "It's okay," she said. "We're here to help you." Leto looked at her suspiciously, between darting glances at the others in the corridor. Sarah took the undoer from her pocket and held it up. "Do you see this?" Leto's eyes widened, and he reached for it reflexively. Obviously, he had forgotten that he didn't have hands. When he saw the stumps, he froze and stared at them. After a moment, he dropped his arms to his side and bowed his head. "Help me to use this, and I'll give you your hands back," Sarah said. Leto looked at her and pointed at his mouthless face with one handless stump. "I know," Sarah said. She motioned for Anonimo to come forward. "This is Anonimo," she continued. "He's a blemmy. He can hear what you're thinking." Leto lunged for Anonimo, staring him in the eyes, obviously thinking at him as hard as he could. Anonimo stumbled backward. Yes, he said. "It's true. I can read minds and we're here to help you. Now calm down." Leto backed away and nodded. Clearly and carefully, Sarah told him, "I need you to tell Anonimo how to use the undoer. Just think it through step by step." Leto nodded slowly and closed his eyes. His breathing was shallow and rapid. Anonimo took a deep breath and bowed his head in concentration, listening intently. Then, very quietly, he said, "First, you must clear your mind. Then you must picture exactly what it is you want to undo. Then, when you are sure you are thinking of nothing else, say the following words. What has been done I now undo by counting 2-1 and then 1-2. Sarah felt the undoer growing warmer, and she held it up. The purple light inside wasn't faint anymore. It had grown in strength, as if it was closer to the surface than it had been before. Leto snapped his eyes open and held his stumps out to Sarah. "Hold on," she said. "First things first." Sarah turned away from Leto and went to her brother. She knelt in front of him and closed her eyes. Concentrating as hard as she could on seeing his mouth back on his face, she lifted the undoer and said, "What has been done I now undo by counting 2-1 and then 1-2. Sarah was terrified. What if the undoer hadn't worked? What if she had somehow done it wrong? She sucked in a deep breath and slowly opened her eyes. Chapter 35. What was undone and what wasn't? "You did it, Sarah," Billy said. "You really did it." Sarah couldn't believe it. The undoer had worked. Billy's mouth was back on his face, and he was talking with it. "I'm talking," Billy said. "I'm actually talking." Sarah hugged her brother tightly, and this time, he hugged her back. He didn't say yuck or what's wrong with you?" And Sarah didn't mind at all. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to find Jeb staring at her with a hungry look in his eye. Sarah smiled at him. Again, she closed her eyes and concentrated. Again, she said the words, and again, she felt the undoer get warmer. When she opened her eyes, she saw that Jeb was crying. His face was whole now, and he rubbed it with both hands, feeling both cheeks, both eyes, both ears. "I don't know how I can ever thank you," he said. "You don't need to thank me," Sarah said. "I couldn't have done it without you. Can I be next, please?" Phoebe said. Sarah faced him and nodded. "Of course, Phoebe," she said, and closed her eyes. She held Phoebe in her mind, and then spoke the words again. "What has been done I now undo by counting 2-1 and then 1-2. When she opened her eyes, Phoebe wasn't a giant bat anymore. He was a little boy in a bat costume. He looked down at himself and said, "My name is Joshua Turner." He looked at Sarah. "My name is Joshua Turner," he said again, as if it was the best news he had ever heard in his life. I remember now. It was Halloween. I was at my grandma's house. We had read a story in school about a house with secret passages and doors in it, and I was just playing around, and I pulled the bookcase out, and I thought it was a real secret passage, and I went through it, and I came here and I found Balthazar, who said he was the king of the cats, but he tricked me and tried to make me take him back, but I couldn't find my way, so he punished me by taking away my memory and turning me into a bat. "It's okay, BB," Sarah said and laughed. "Joshua, I mean, it's almost all over now. You'll be home soon and everything will be back the way it was." Joshua nodded. Sarah turned around and faced Leto. "All right," she said. "Now you." Leto bowed his head and held up his stumps. Sarah closed her eyes and pictured him whole. Again she said the words, and again she felt the undoer glow warmly in her hand. When she opened her eyes, Leto had his hands and mouth back. He touched his lips with his fingers and then opened his eyes and looked at Sarah. He stared at the undoer in her hand. But there wasn't any joy in his eyes, only a kind of terrible rage. "Give it to me," he shrieked in a voice that sounded like tearing metal. As he lunged at her, Sarah tried to dive out of the way, but she was too late. He crashed into her, and they both fell to the floor. Jeb and Joshua grabbed Leto from behind and tried to pull him off Sarah, but they couldn't. He was much bigger than they were. Edgar came forward to help, but there was no room for him. "Billy!" Sarah yelled. He looked at her, his eyes going wide. She threw the undoer to him and he caught it. "Quickly," she said. "Undo him." When Leto saw what Sarah had done, he started to get up. Instead of pulling on him, Jeb and Joshua now sat on him with their full weight, trying to keep him pinned to the ground while Billy closed his eyes and said, "What once was done I now undo by counting down 2-1 and then 1-2. Nothing happened." "That's not it," Sarah yelled. Billy opened his eyes, frantic. "I can't remember," he said. "We can't hold him any longer." Jeb shouted. Leto pushed up as hard as he could, and Jeb and Joshua both fell backward, crashing into Edgar and the guard, and knocking them over, too. Sarah, now free, pulled herself up and dove for Billy. She grabbed his hands with both of hers so that each of them was touching the undoer. "You think it," she said. "I'll say it." "Will that work?" he asked. "We have to try." Billy closed his eyes and Sarah said, "What has been done I now undo by counting 2-1 and then 1-2. There was a sudden flash of light brighter than anything she had ever seen. For a moment, Sarah thought a bolt of lightning had shot through the ceiling. She and Billy both fell over and went into a spin. She tried to hold on to him, but something started to pull them apart. Then she saw the others spinning around them at the same time, as if they were all caught in a whirlpool of light. Then everything came apart. Leto whooshed away first, shooting through the brightness until he vanished from sight, and all that was left of him was his voice, screaming new. Anonimo followed right behind him, and just as fast, he, too, was gone. Then Edgar whirled past Sarah. When their eyes met, he said, "Oh, dear," and zipped away as if he had been launched from a slingshot. Joshua flew by next, flapping the wings of his Halloween costume as hard as he could, but it was no use. Like the others, he shot off into the light and was gone. Finally, Jeb launched off, his eyes wide, his mouth open, but his face was still all there. Sarah didn't understand what was happening. She looked down and saw that she and Billy were still holding on to each other, the undoer between them. She didn't know for how much longer, though. Even now, their grip was slipping. Then Sarah felt a hand grab her arm and she saw Balthazar behind her. Only he hadn't bothered with the cat disguise. His hair was smoke and his eyes were fire and his mouth glowed like 4th of July fireworks. "What have you done?" he roared. "Not what we've done," Sarah shouted. "What we've undone." She felt Billy's hand slip from her fingers and both of them whooshed away. Suddenly, darkness surrounded her as completely as the light had only a moment before. She kicked her feet and flailed her arms, and all at once her covers flew off and she was in her bedroom, back in her bed. She froze, catching her breath. For a long time, she remained perfectly still, staring at the moonlit ceiling. Then she heard footsteps in the hall, outside her room. The door opened and Billy came in, rubbing his eyes. Sarah sat up and looked at him. "Billy," she said, "are you all right?" He nodded. Did everything that I think just happened really happen? Now it was Sarah's turn to nod. "What were you thinking when we used the undoer?" "Just that I wanted everyone to go back where they belonged." Sarah smiled. "That must be what happened," she said. Everyone went home. Sarah looked at the clock now and saw that it was almost 3 a.m. Billy took another step into her room. "What about Balthazar?" Sarah shrugged. "I guess he must be back in his cabin." "What about the undoer?" "I thought you had it," Sarah said. Billy shook his head. "I thought you had it." "I wish," Sarah said. "There are some things around here that I'd like to undo." "Like me, I suppose?" Billy asked. Sarah laughed. "Nope. Believe it or not, I think you did okay. All things considered." "Really?" "Really. So what do we do now?" "Go back to sleep," Sarah said. "I'm exhausted." "But if Balthazar is back in his cabin, that means he'll still be trying to find a way through. We have to go back and stop him." Sarah twisted her hair. "I don't know. If we go behind the bookcase again, Something worse might happen this time. Can't be any worse than what Balthazar is trying to do, Billy said. Sarah nodded. You're right about that. Just then, they heard a loud banging downstairs. Sarah and Billy looked at each other. Then Sarah looked at the clock. It was exactly 3 o'clock. Oh, no, she said. The sleepers. Quickly, she jumped out of bed and dropped to her knees. I hope you didn't undo this, she said, shoving her hands under the mattress and pulling out the journal and the key. Phew, she said as she got to her feet and started for the door. Wait, Billy said. Where are you going? Downstairs to let the dead in. But what about Mom and Dad? I guess they're in for a big surprise. Billy smiled. Wait for me, he said. This I gotta see. Together, the two of them ran downstairs.